Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our thought leadership series this month. We are going to cover a very interesting topic, which is related to process and equitable. How do you establish equitable process in organization? Let me introduce myself. I'm Pothan. I'm a partner with Interweave Consulting. Uh, my experience has been a combination of both consulting and organizational HR, working with most of the consulting firms like Mercer, Towers Watson, and Aon. Uh, and I've also had a short stint, working as the research head for Corporate Executive Board. Let me also welcome Subir, and I'm going to pass it on to Subir now to introduce himself. Uh, Subir,
Thank you,
yeah.
Pothan. I'll give a brief introduction about myself. Pothan used to be my manager in Towers Watson. Like him, I've also spent a fair bit of time in consulting in firms like Mercer, Hewitt, and Towers Watson. And I've had a variety of exposures within consulting, and I had the fortune of working for companies in line HR. And I've had the privilege of seeing how concepts and frameworks are deployed in a real world scenario. And some of the things that we want to talk to you about will be covered in some of the experiences. And it will be my intention to talk to you about how these things come to life, or real world examples that we've seen. So I think for the session today, this is this is taking us away from the traditional approaches to inclusion. And when Pothan was speaking to me about some of the work that they're doing at Interweave, there was a very interesting concept of how we need to bring more data to the discussion, and that can be enabled through something called the process audit. Now, process audit is a little different from the typical policy review, and I think maybe we could start with that, Pothan, where you could walk us through that perspective you shared with me.
Yeah. So let me start with giving a very high level difference between what a policy review and a process audit is, and how that can be very different from each other. Uh, a policy is basically setting the guardrails in terms of what should and what shouldn't be done as part of a particular process. But when you look at the process itself, it's a lot more than that. It's the policy will only define what, but doesn't get into the details of how it needs to get done. Many a times I've heard people talking about policy review and process audit interchangeably, which is very different from each other. And policy reviews are basically looking at systemically how we have written the guardrails, and then the process review is about looking at how do we look at what goes into it, what's the procedure, and how equity is maintained while you are doing it, or implementing that or executing it as a process. So let me go through a very short introduction to what process reviews and process audits are, and how does that translate into helping the organization to become more equitable and inclusive. Mitch, if you don't mind, can we go to the next slide? Now, a process, I mean, let's start the whole process with an audit itself. And it's basically the audit is all about understanding the current state, how the process is operating, what are the procedures, what are the different decision points. Now, if I were to look at decision points, there are a few things that we need to talk about. One, what's the information that you need? How does the information flow within the process? And what information is required to make a decision? And what's the cognitive process that we go through in order to make that decision? So there are two parts to it: information and the cognitive process. And the third element is basically the person or the individual who takes that decision. Without that, the decision is not made. So when we look at the key stakeholders, who is making that decision is the other part of it. And it's important to understand who all are involved in a decision making process, because the perspectives may differ. The perceptions about equity may vary based on who is making the decision, who is receiving the decision. So it's important for us to understand information, the cognitive process, and the individual who makes a decision, in order to understand, or in order to get to the next level of, or create a foundation for us to understand the equity of a particular process, and the decisions that are involved in a process. Now, to get to that, we need to look at data. And the most important factor is, many times it's very difficult to look at anecdotes and decide that the process is equitable. Unfortunately, many times we don't get into the data and understand whether the process is really equitable or not. So it's important to collect data for each and every decision point and collate it and analyze it. And we'll get to that in the next slide about analyzing it. Equally important is how perceptions uh, are evolved, or how what are the perceptions, first of all, and how it got evolved in an organization, how it got established in an organization. I always talk about, no, when we are also talking between both of us, we're talking about, no, my ex-boss talking about perception is reality with a lag. So always perceptions are made based on certain observations, certain experiences of people. Unless you change that, those perceptions won't change. But first of all, it's important to understand those perceptions as we move on with respect to basing a lot of our decisions on data and uh, quantitatively validated perceptions of people who are involved in that process, both decision makers and decision receivers. Which, if we could move to the next slide.
Seems there's a lag.
I think so. Yeah.
So I'll have a question for you, Pothan, towards the end to say the relevance of stakeholder perspective and decision points, but I think we'll wait for this too. Yeah.
Okay, let's move to, once we've collected all these perceptions from people and the data that's data related to talent decisions that we make as part of our day-to-day HR practices that we have, or talent management process that we have in organization. We have to deploy a lot of statistical analysis in many places. Uh, we could look at, what are the distribution of data between different demographic segments, looking at causality of different factors, particularly coming from perception, and a particular perception being driven by certain other factors, or people think that the reality that they feel like is what is on the ground. Or it could be ratios in terms of, how decisions are skewed towards a uh, particular segment or not. Or even deeper statistical analysis of causal relationship building between uh, different distributions that we see internally using regression analysis. So it could be complex, and sometimes it could be extremely complex to understand and establish some of those causal relations, particularly when it comes to process like pay parity, etc. Now, once we have all this analysis done, uh, it's the primary objective is to understand what are patterns of inequity in an organization. That's where we go to deep dive into the data and see, can we unearth some of the patterns which are not obvious when you go through a process. But when you start analyzing it, there are patterns which says that, okay, yeah, there are inequities which we may not have otherwise observed in a particular process. The other aspect of it's perceptions of inequity. So I'm going to look at two different concepts: patterns of inequity, which comes from data, and perceptions of inequity, which comes from uh, the feedback that we get from stakeholders through an instrument, a survey, or even looking at other qualitative data gathering techniques like, focus group discussion or focus interviews, etc. Now, once we have both these patterns of inequity and perceptions of inequity, we will then get to understanding what are some of those actionable insights we can derive from it. At the end of the day, that those actionable insights are the ones we're going to now take forward and make changes to the process, that it becomes more equitable to the stakeholders, across all the stakeholders in that process. Now, at the first stage, we will not be prioritizing these actionable insights. We will gather all the actionable insights and then prioritize it based on feasibility of those insights. That's the second stage. But the first stage is to look at a non-prioritized all um, all the insights that we could actually gather which are actionable, and then prioritize it to say that, okay, these are practical, these are implementable, these are not implementable. Sometimes it may be complex enough that no, you may not want to take it forward, or there may be challenges in the organization which it may have, that it cannot be taken forward in the way in which we might think it should be. So that's where we actually now get into, if I were to have a set of actionable insight prioritized, what do I do next as a process? Mitch, if you could move to the next slide. I think there is a slight lag in, I think, getting to move to.
Reality with a lag.
All right. Now, again, I'm going to introduce two different aspects of, how do we take this forward from actionable insights to a process, a change in the process that could help reduce the subjectivity in decision making. The first one is, transparent criteria. So I just, the objective with which I put that step in this entire process is to make sure that we're creating boundaries. Everything cannot be transparent, and there are boundaries within which we need to operate. I'm being practical in a way in which how we typically do things in an organization. Everything cannot be transparent. Everything cannot be completely equitable. That there is no subjectivity exist within the organization. So the transparent criteria is to establish the boundaries within which we need to operate, and be transparent about those boundaries and the criteria. And then within those boundaries, how do we make the process more objective, reducing the level of subjectivity, and what procedural changes that we could bring about with the right amount of right guidelines behind it, to make it as objective and as bias free as possible. So the first part is to make it more the clarifying or defining the boundaries, and be transparent about those boundaries. Some are and some are not, in terms of transparency. And within those boundaries of transparency, you're going to define how objectively that the particular process can be defined and executed within the organization. Now, there's a whole lot of things on the right side of the slide, which is basically about measurements. Why should we measure? I mean, it's first thing is to establish a metric that would help us to understand whether we are making progress or not. And once we establish that metric, then what we need to do is, where are we today? What's the current state? That's clearly establishing a baseline for that particular change that we want to take forward. And lastly, if we know the metric and if we know the current state, do we have a rig or a mechanism which helps us to monitor the process regularly? So unless we do this, we do not know whether we are making progress in terms of what we want to achieve and how we want to achieve it. And at the same time, there is no way we can communicate to people that we are making progress. Oftentimes, we intuitively say that we are making progress, but how can we make it more tacit and explicit for people to know that we're making progress in a particular direction? If not, what do we need to change? That's also another strategy, that no, if you're not making change, why it's not happening, and what else do we need to make those progress in terms of the changes that we need to experience or we need to make in organization with respect to establishing equitable and inclusive processes. Now, lastly, just have one more slide and then we will get into a conversation. Mitch, I think there's a lag again. It's like, I don't know, it's a day. Sometimes technology supports, sometimes they don't. It doesn't. Yeah. Now, this particular slide is all about how do we sustain it. First of all, how do we enable that change to get embedded in the organization? So first part is basically all about training. So I always believe that making people skilled increases the willingness for them to change. So if we don't skill them to deliver a change in the organization, it's going to be extremely difficult for them, first of all, accept that change, and second, the resistance towards that change will be significant. So one of the important things that we need to do is, when we establish these changes in in processes, we need to make sure that the stakeholders that we identified are taken through a change management process where each one of them is skilled to do or execute the new change process or new change that we establish. Second thing is, feeling that they're being heard while we are making these changes. There is a mechanism for them to actually come back to and come back and ask the organization to review the process, so that they feel that no, there could be challenges that we would have, we are overseen, and how do we now incorporate some of those challenges, and how do we make the process work more effectively and efficiently within the organization. And at the same time, there could be potential possibilities that no, we would have overlooked some of those biases, and we may want to incorporate some of those things. It shouldn't happen, but it's all human. We are all human beings, it could happen as well. And lastly, success breeds success, right? How do we communicate the success? How do we celebrate it together? How do you recognize some of the positive behaviors that we observe, so that rest of them also learn from those modeling that we communicate across the organization? So, as important as or as important as making the changes in the process, it's equally important to make these investments in these areas as well, to make the change uh, accelerate or established and sustained in an organization. So I'm going to stop here, and because
Yeah, so both are lots of questions. In fact, lots of questions, and some of it is also about the what we started the conversation with, about how it's a process audit, and how we'll be generating a lot more data. But I think we could start by the point which was on the first slide, and probably I'm going to structure this and go slide by slide. I think we should talk a little more about the decision points which are relevant for data gathering and analysis. So how are they? It's a new concept that a lot of people who are not traditionally on the side of analytics models, or who've not done a database investigation, they're not really familiar with. So maybe we could start with that, and you could elaborate that point a little further.
yeah. So I like to define decision points are specific junctures in our specific instances in a particular process where information needs to be processed to take a decision. So I would leave it there as a broad definition. And some of these decisions could be very obvious, like, for example, going through a selection process, right? So you know what to look for in a candidate. There are guidelines, there are selection criteria that we would have established ahead of the whole process. So you are aware of how to go about and what to look for, and how to get that captured in that particular decision. But there are decisions we often overlook, like, for example, you're going to apply for a job. That's also a decision point, because you are reviewing a lot of information which comes through the job description. I'm just trying to get to the nuances of decision points, where a candidate reviewing of a job description is a decision point for the candidate. So that's where we talk about inequities and biases in job descriptions, and how it can favor some of the candidates, it can be not favorable for others. How the role will be perceived by one person will be different from another person. So those are nuanced decision points which we would look for, particularly in the context of an equity analysis in a process, which may not be as deep in terms of if you were to look at a typical process analysis or process mapping that we would do. I mean, it wouldn't reflect as deep as that. But majority of the data points are decisions which are taken where the information is explicit, the information is analyzed, and a decision is taken for or against. Those are decision points. Now, as I've told earlier, no, there are three parts to it. One, the information that's required to take the decision. It could be transparent, it could be complete, incomplete, it could be asymmetric, that some people may have, some people may not have. And the cognitive process. How do I take those decisions with available information? And third, who is take the person who takes the decision. And I think I would also put the fourth one, the person who receives the consequence or the outcome of that decision.
Right. No, that's very helpful. I think it leads to the follow-on point for discussion to say why are it's actually why is data important in the analysis itself. So the actual impact it has. And I'll start by giving a non-data experience that we had, which raises the value of this. We had people on board who used hearing aids while working, and it's basically people who have some sort of visual impairment. And out of the two people who we took on board as part of an experiment for coordination roles, the feedback for one was very positive, and the other was that this person is struggling. And then we started asking questions to say, why is it that people who have similar profiles, is there something that we need to look at for enablement? And we discovered that the manager for one person who had come from a company that was familiar with working with people with disabilities was aware that in PDF, in Adobe PDF, there's a feature that allows you to turn a document which is friendly for hearing aids. Now, as a checklist, people were preparing the information that was required. It's just that one person would make sure it's sanitized for someone with listening aids, and the other party did not. They were not aware, and consequently, this person was trying their best to perform, but the tools that were available to them weren't really helpful. And the other person, because it was information was better prepared for them to basically the reasonable accommodation that these guys made to enable them allowed them to perform far better than the other person. Now this was an inquiry where a person had to go and ask for data, and to my mind this just is an example of how many other patterns may be existing which are not obvious to us. So I think
Very
this.
interesting observation, Subir, because we often don't look at the access to information as a reason for inequities. I mean, oftentimes access to information is a very important factor that we need to consider. It could be because of people with different abilities, or it could be that no, it's not accessible or it's not available to all employees equitably across the organization for them to take decisions. That's why, I mean, that actually sets us into the next thing, which was talking about perspectives and perceptions. That's
Right.
actually makes our perceptions change with what's available to us as individuals when we receive a decision or make a decision. It actually changes the perspective completely and the perceptions around it. In terms of what's the objective with which you're taking a decision is one aspect of it, but what's available to me to take those decisions to achieve those objectives another aspect, which you brought up very very nicely through this example of how a person with different abilities here in this context wanting having to have a particular application enabled to get that information. Otherwise we would have overlooked such instances where people may not. And I mean, another example I could give is people who may not be very familiar with technology or maybe comfortable with technology because of different reasons. It could be some of the abilities that they have with for them it would be different to access and use a computer. How would we accommodate them? What are alternate ways by which we make information available for the decision is to be taken in the most objective manner? So I just also want to ask you about what are some of the techniques that you have incorporated in analyzing data in your consulting experience and also in the organizations that you worked with?
Yeah, so I think one of the things, Pothan, I'd like to share is how a lot of these process audits are like a fishing expedition, like any analytics investigation. If you start with the end in mind, then you're possibly biasing the analysis or the tools and techniques. But if you go with a very open mind to say, let's discover what we find out, I've seen it's very helpful to get around the unconscious bias, or the viewing of patterns. One thing that at the most at the most tactical level, one thing that has worked very often for me is I look at share of something. So let's take a share of attrition versus share of population. So for a manager, what's the share of attrition versus share of population? It suddenly throws up a lot of insights. The moment you start analyzing this in the context of, let's take say, a process audit, it's really helpful. Where you have benchmarks, it's really good. But this bit about share off is great from a baselining point of view. So I've established a baseline, and then you see who's performing better than the baseline, who's performing worse than the baseline, and then with a lot of empathy, you go and ask why is someone doing so much better than the benchmark, why is someone, and that is where the discovery happens. The other thing that I use is confirm and falsify. So once you do have a hypothesis that emerges from this baseline, then you go in to say this correlates, but the opposite of that should be falsified. So this, by the time you're done with this, the pattern starts emerging, and the insights, they start working. But I think that's more of something that I've been doing as a practitioner. You have more experience with research techniques. What's your perspective on what really works?
Yeah, I would like to explain this with an example that we have done for an organization. The basic initial perception that they had was, men are paid more than women. I mean, very simple one. And if you look at simple average, it's absolutely right. Men are paid more than women. But we started getting into a deeper statistical analysis of normal distribution, looking at the overlap of the curves and all the stuff. Uh, and once we started getting into, I mean, one of the fundamental principles of equity is that, you're comparing equals, right? And when we started comparing equals in terms of, slicing and dicing the data with respect to levels, and with respect to different locations that they work from, with different functions, we realize that no, vast majority of places, women are paid more than men. So statistically, if you look at it from a normal distribution curve, and how it actually look at the statistical validation of, where there is an overlap of curves and significant overlap or non-significant overlap, we realize that significant overlap exists between men and women, but that overlap is more towards women getting paid higher than men. But if you were to add the senior leadership team, it completely gets skewed. So the distribute the pattern, or the distribution of people was making the whole thing differently, uh, uh, perceived to be different from the reality, where if you actually normalize it for the same population, or same kind of population size, or the sample, the story was very different. So you could get deeper into it and see how those patterns emerge. The other thing which I could think of is distribution charts. It's not about, normal distribution, but simple distribution by classes, and seeing where exactly it exists, not how much, where exactly it exists, and then look at the level of differentiation that we have for different classes, to understand, where are those points, where are those places where the biases exist, rather than generalizing it across the board. So those are some of the areas, which I think, which are some of the things, in addition to what you explained, in terms of correlations and simple ratios and all those things that we typically do. The If we could move on to actually looking at, some of these things with the perceptions that we see, it's interesting. Anything that you could talk about, how perceptions were integrated into data insights and perceptions, interesting to actually merge these things together to understand what I talked about: perceptions of equity and patterns of equity.
So I found that pure quant or pure qualitative is never as effective as combining the two. And the moment you have perspectives, let's take say something's coming through from focus group discussions. Uh, Oftentimes we find that the perception has no basis in data, but it's something which is perpetuating because so many people believe it perpetuates, and that's where actually the anti-inclusion practices start getting set up. But I've also seen it's very hard to persuade people with data. Even after the perceptions are very hard to change, and it's why it's very important to make sure that perceptions are addressed, and we use tools like process audit to discover those. But once it's done, and you've discovered that gap in perceptions, then falsifying that, or finding reasons as to why the perception took root, more than data, trying to find the root of where the perception started and then sharing that information with people is far more persuasive, because it helps people understand why something like this started. But not too many examples I could share of that, as much as I could talk about how stakeholders have a big impact in shaping those perceptions. And why in any exercise related to inclusion, it's very important to find not only those who are very vocally aligned, and they've got the motivations and reasons, but also to find those who may not be speaking up for whatever reasons, who don't come across as completely sold on the idea, or skeptics. So before beginning something like this, would you say, so what's the role of stakeholders? If you could talk a little bit about stakeholder perspectives, that would be
So,
helpful.
that's where I think the importance of collecting the perceptions are important. Like, I'll take another example where we were doing an analysis on hiring data, and overall perception was that it's very difficult to get women employees as a channel through multiple channels. But then we started getting deeper into it. Uh, the primary channel that they've had was referral, because a lot of hiring happens in remote locations, and 99% of them are men. So it's natural that they provide more uh, resumes of male candidates. And you started looking at the data and then looking at perception. It's coming together and said, okay, yeah, this is because of a reality that exists today, and if you change that reality, then you can change the perception as well. So how do we change the reality is then that we need to look at, how do we look at alternate channels that we can source data or source candidates who are women candidates, and then start changing the perception that, how do we how the hiring managers think that, the availability of talent in those remote locations. So it actually goes together in terms of how perceptions are made and formed, and how it's reinforced, and how the data sometimes supports it, and sometimes it completely negates it and say, no, there is no foundation for it. Now let's move, on to establishing these potential biases through these patterns, and establishing transparent criteria. In some places, the good example that I can think about is, many organizations ask, why can't we make pay completely transparent? Obvious reasons. All pay cannot be made completely transparent. So one of the important steps in the whole process is to make sure that there are guardrails put. What does transparency mean, and what does information availability means, and what decision means within the uh, available levers that we can actually use to make a decision. So establishing the criteria is very important, even before we establish a procedure and a process to make it less subjective. So anything that you want to add on? I'm just cognizant about the time. I think we may have a couple of minutes more and may not get into the rest of the process, but we'll stop
So
here with this particular one.
I think so. I'll talk a little bit about how, in an organization I worked with in the past, we discovered that it was incredibly hard to hire women for STEM roles. And the point that was put forward was that in the coding exam that we'll put forward, we used to find that women are at the bottom of the stack rank. And typically, by the time we are done with the top of the stack rank for interviews, we used to meet our quota and we used to say that we hired the best people. We oftentimes won't even go as far as the bottom of the stack rank or whatever threshold we decided. And started by the transparent criteria. We started by saying who all have been successful within the organization. Let's look at the women who've been successful, and then we look at their test scores from the time that they were hired. And we discovered that the baseline effect was coming into play, where even in that year they hadn't scored as much as some of the men, but at the workplace they were performing far better, or if not at par with those people who had been seen as the really most valuable hire on campus. And I think that's the point where the perception started to say that are we holistically measuring at the time of joining the criteria that makes people successful in the job later? And this is when we started embracing the concept of, so the transparency, the equal criteria was that we need to see, at least for the interview stage, top of the stack rank, separated the stack ranks for men and women, and we said top of the stack rank for both, and then let's see who comes through. And we were just shocked at how, uh, in the interview process, how the women were routinely leaving a far better impression on the interviewers, and results consistently came through that they're performing as well. It's one of those things that working in teams requires far more of the collaborative skills, which for some reason we didn't see men display as much as women, and that started contributing significantly. So that was a massive change at the entry level about how the criteria, if we just take a different perspective, saying that we'll take the norms for both sides, translated into a huge difference.
Very interesting. It's a very good example of how the whole process change can actually change the overall decisions, and how a particular outcome can be changed as a result of it. Uh, very good example. So let me summarize this in Subir, before we open up for questions. First of all, a process audit absolutely important to understand decision points, data, and data patterns. Secondly, it's about perceptions of different stakeholders, the context in which they make those perceptions, the perceptions are formed, and what could be the reasons and root cause behind those perceptions. So both these will actually help us understand potential biases and potential actions we could take, which then we can take forward into creating criteria or defining the boundaries as transparent criteria that we talked about, and redefining the processes and decision processes, particularly to look at more equitable outcomes for organization and for individuals. So that's with that. I think we'll open up for questions, and we have almost 10 minutes to answer any
Sure.
questions that you have.
Um, Potan, it'll be great if you could select the questions that we should answer. I think we are going to see a flurry of questions. So let's pick the ones uh, that you think we haven't covered in the discussion we've had.
Let me check if there's anything that has come through from.
Yeah, so I have one question which
Did
is
you
on the
did you
screen.
did you look at test scores of men who are doing well at work? So why don't you go
Yeah.
about answering that?
Yeah, so we looked at both. So see the point I made earlier about confirming and falsifying. That's what we've done, where we looked at how well. So we look essentially, we started with who's doing well in the company, who's not doing well, and then how did they, the baseline of what the test scores look like. We started with that, and then we found that the men who had scored much higher were performing great or at par, or whatever and how are the women performing against that. So that was the benchmark, and both were compared. In fact, that was the trigger point for us to start saying that let's look at this from a different perspective, where the top of the stacks for men and women, let's separate that and then bring them to the interview.
Which would you want to open up for questions, or is that how we do it? All right, only one question. All right. So I think I had a few things which I could actually cover. What is a transparent criteria? It's like a question that many people would have. There is absolutely no right or wrong.
Yeah.
Cannot eliminate subjectivity or completely. So it's about looking at reducing the level of subjectivity rather than eliminating it completely. And anything that we do is related to a previous state and to a new state. So that could also change over a period of time when we start reviewing it at a later point in time with a different set of transparent criteria. So there's nothing absolute about this entire process. It's all about relative. And the other thing which I want to share was about, it's a discovery process. A lot of people ask, can you just give me a standard way of doing it? I said, no, it's a discovery process. Sometimes I don't find out anything.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. So, Posan, I'd like to talk a little bit about why data is so important, because I, in my interactions, I found that a lot of leaders, uh, there is this view that a lot of this may be a fad, or let's just go along because this seems to be the flavor of the season. And some of these people are the ones who made their bones by being very data oriented, or taking data back decisions. And the moment it seems anything that is lacking the rigor of having had a thorough analysis or having had some data behind it, they they see this as a performative view, something that requires more evidence, and they will go along, but they're not really bought into the process. And I think that's the segment which, when identified, when addressed, and you can't really speak to them specifically. It's very hard to identify those who may be just going along and those who are completely allied to the cause. Using something like this is really powerful. And what I've noticed is that when you start talking to them with data, especially on topics like these, and you say that this is a sincere inquiry to learn more about how things work, you find that they become your biggest supporters. They also want to get into the analysis. And that's the time when aspects like transparency of criteria becomes, the moment you involve more people into the analysis, saying this is the aim, these are the means, some of these people can come and surprise you with the perspectives on techniques, some of the other meta sources that is indicative of the direction you're trying to establish the truth. And then they become the champions of those insights. And I've seen using that, that's one of the, it's a roundabout way to get to the same objective. It's just that the strength of that resolve or the sponsorship is so much more powerful when it's coming from somebody who's bought into this idea using data.
I've personally experienced that, Subir, in many places where once you have established that there is data proving some of these perceptions that we have, or proving against some of those perceptions that we have, the conviction with which we can talk about it, and the conviction with which come people rally around it, is a lot different from not having that data, or not having that insight that would have helped to galvanize that process, that sponsorship that we need.
Relatedly, Botan, I had a question which is a tricky question. Let me prepare you for this. But I've been wondering since we started talking to say, if someone was short of resources, how challenging it is to get good analytics resources in an organization. Most of them are, directed towards commercial discussions or solving the more vexing or immediate problems, and steps towards inclusions are more strategic. So one, resources are in short supply, and if you wanted to show results quickly, which area of HR, let's take, so should it be hiring, should it be comp, should it be performance management, where could you score some good wins, quick wins? And if possible, would you have a perspective to say, looking in this direction will probably get you the results fastest? Would you have a perspective on that?
I would look at that from two different aspects. One is, once we understand the inequities, how challenging is to rectify that or overcome that from different aspects. One, okay, let me talk about pay. Significant area where you can actually increase the engagement to a large extent, where people can people feel that it's equitable across the board. But oftentimes what we see is the amount of resource required is very, very large in some places where the inequities are significantly large. The other, I think, the most impactful area is selection, hiring, etc. Because that's where, I mean, if you really look at the decision points that we have in selection, I would say the maximum number of decision points are when you go through a selection process, and number of stakeholders involved in that process. If you look at that, I think that's the maximum. I would say the most critical of all the HR processes that we should be looking at. I'm not undermining the importance of any other, like for
Yeah,
example pay or promotion or performance or any of thing, but hiring is one area where I think there is maximum return on investment that you make.
I also see this as it's a bit of a fight for, because let's take this. just for perspective, as I'm speaking more on the STEM side of things, like I keep sharing, Indigo does not have a diversity problem on gender diversity, because that's part of the business strategy. But let's take, say, if you were a company that's hiring graduates on for STEM related disciplines, most engineering colleges have a percentage of women which is 20% or less, and that's a recent phenomenon between 15 to 18% where you land up. But the older, longer back you look, it's harder to find people or women who are crossing more than 10%. And then also there were certain streams where in mechanical it used to be very hard to find someone who, professors themselves were hesitant to hire women because it required a lot of crawling around in broilers and so on. So when you look at the total percentage pool, despite the natural redundancy, for any company to go beyond 20%, you're basically robbing Peter to pay Paul. One company ends up losing and they have a larger. It's not really that you're helping the entire ecosystem. Some companies trying to gather more within their. Now, if it is such a competitive environment and you are trying to have policies that make you more attractive to, in this case, let's just talk about gender diversity. If you're more inclusive to women or more attractive to women, what you need to do is fix things at the funnel, which is hiring side. Get more people in, then you can start doing a little more analysis on things like inclusion issues for gender diversity at promotion stage or compensation stage. And in that, I've noticed that something as simple as having a funnel distribution, saying, is your funnel at the start of it equal 50-50? Because there's nothing stopping you from, certain disciplines. Yes, if you're looking for an architect for a very niche, deep tech space, it probably will be a little hard for you to find 50% funnel, but you could try. uh, you start with that perspective, it's easier for you to find the biases in your process. But if you don't have a baseline to start with, then it's very hard to tell whether certain hiring managers are exhibiting an unconscious bias in their hiring practices.
So just one thought around that, Subir, and we'll close with this. I think uh, we have to look at our prerequisites for jobs. That I strongly believe in that, and I personally feel that it's over-indexed for many of the jobs from a screening criteria perspective. Now, if we were to look at equity, we need to look at equitable prerequisites. And if you were to re-establish those prerequisites, like for example, many places you talk about having a degree for doing certain jobs, and absolutely not required when if you were to train the person 6 months on the job. So why do you put that prerequisite of having a degree? And that actually screens out a lot of people who are diverse, and you're actually, narrowing that particular pool of people that you could have hired. So we need to actually think differently in order to get to some of the outcomes that we need to achieve in equitable practice and a diversity representation, which is more representative of the community that we are in. Right. Thank you. Thanks a lot, Subir. Thank you very much for being part of this conversation, and I really enjoyed it. And thank you, everyone, for being part of this session that we had, sharing thoughts around equitable processes and establishing and sustaining equitable processes. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you, bye bye.